You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Sons of the Shoe is back. Nick Wilson, Spencer German with you for the next little bit here. Good day, everyone. Happy day, Buckeye Nation. A lot of really good recruiting news coming in. The new coaching staff has hit the ground running, including James Laurinaitis, with a lot more 2025 recruits coming on in. So good news abound for the Buckeyes and good news for college football. As a real quick reminder, we are a relatively new podcast. Please make sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, 923thefan.com, the free Odyssey app. We appreciate your patronage. We survive because you pay attention to our podcast, and we greatly appreciate that. Don't forget also, subscribe to the 923 The Fan YouTube channel. Make sure to leave us your comments in the comment section on the Sons of the Shoe playlist, guys. We eat that up. If you haven't seen it, we do like to interact. Sometimes it's Michigan fans, sometimes it's Ohio State fans, sometimes it's just a general college football fan giving us love or hate. So remember, 923 The Fan YouTube channel, comments, subscribe, and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Spotify, and whatever. But not only do we have a big news for the next 2 years of college football, Spencer, this week is going to be huge for college football at large because this week the conference commissioners plus Notre Dame leadership is meeting in Dallas to start to hash out what 2026 and beyond looks like for the college football playoff. We're going to get to that later in this part of the segment, later in this part of the show, but that looks to be really contentious. What we do know is that finally, after years of quibbling, it's been a certainty that they're going to go to 12 teams in 2024. But now we finally know what it's going to look like as everybody's finally settled on this 5v12 format, which is what they're calling it. That is a slight adjustment from 6v6, where it was the 6 conference champions and then 6 at large. Now, in part because the Pac-12 doesn't really exist, now it's going to be 5 versus 7. Your thoughts on the switch to this? Because really, it's just going to be for the next 2 years before they probably shake that Etch-a-Sketch one more time for the 2026 and beyond seasons all the way through 31-32.
Yeah, and when that change comes, I think some of the formatting of this will stay the same. I think part of the 5v7 format that they established was that the 5 highest ranked conference champions are getting in. They get kind of like an auto bid essentially, and the top 4 seeds will always go to teams that won their conference. That'll probably be your 4 major conferences, if that's what it looks like, or your 4 Power Fives. But I think that will probably end up staying the same if they expand the field even further, just because they're clearly trying to prioritize the things that we talk ad nauseum about Nick, this is basically the conversations we have in early December every year. How much does a conference championship matter? How much does strength of schedule matter? How much does out of conference schedule matter? They're basically answering all those questions for you by setting it up this way, where they're saying, okay, conference champions, you guys get a little bit of an extra boost because you're playing in a conference. You guys will be guaranteed a bye if you're one of the top. If you win your conference and you're a top ranked team, of all the other conference teams that are out there. So I think that's important context. I'm interested to see what decisions kind of loom large in terms of what it looks like moving forward. It sounds like 16 teams. We can talk about whether or not we like that or not. And also, I think this has big implications for just the power structure, because by 2028, who knows what the landscape of college football is going to look like in terms of these 2 mega conferences that are sort of starting to form themselves, the Big Ten and the SEC, and who's maybe joining forces with them in the next 3 to 4 years. Who's maybe joining the SEC in the next 3 to 4 years.
Let's not burn all those right in the moment, because I do think those are all things that we can get to on this.
Yeah.
I just think I think there actually is some subtle genius to the way they've set this up. And I don't know that this was intentional, but one of the big talking points on moving to 12 teams is it's going to obliterate the conversation on what is important, what isn't important, right? Which is the regular season, which is winning a conference championship. And I actually think, like, if you drop this into buckets, right? The top 4 conference champions, there's going to be a massive advantage in a 12-team format to having that bye. And then that second group of 4 teams, right? The 5 through 8, they have a built-in advantage here of you want to play to get as high of a seed as you can. You want to do as much politic as you can because the 5 through 8 seed are actually going to host the first round games at their respective schools. And then obviously the 9 through 12 is going to be hotly debated because somebody's got to be 13. And it's funny that people think that conversation is going to change. I think it's going to be more nationally relevant because now all of a sudden, 1, you've got the 3 buckets like I described. 2, now all of a sudden, like, you can't just say, well, if you don't win your conference or if you're not one of the 4 best conferences, it doesn't matter because, there's no difference between being the 5 seed and the 12 seed. That's not true. And honestly, I think it's going to only open up. I think once you get past probably the top 7, I think we saw this year, there were 7 teams that could have made the playoffs this year in a 4-team field.
Yeah.
You had like legitimate cases. If you get 7, that's great because the next 7 to 10 are going to be widely contested. So I think this is best of both worlds. You get more teams, which means more money. Every kind of bucket that you can drop in incentivizes you different. And I think the conversation is still going to be the conversation. Like, how could this team be 13 and this team be 12? How could this team be 10 and this team could be 15? Like, I think this is everything you want it to be. And it's funny that it's probably only going to be for 2 years because this looks great. Like, I really like the way they've set it up. The quarterfinals and semifinals are going to rotate between the New Year's 6 bowls. Like, I think this is as good as you can possibly get with the way this thing is going to be set up, given how just contentious this got with the league.
Well, and the Notre Dame part of this is fascinating too, because Notre Dame doesn't play in a conference, they can only ever finish as high as the 5 spot. So that means they are guaranteed every time the playoff comes around. And I don't know that they'll keep this the same for this when they expand again. That'll obviously is to be TBD when they have that discussion. But at least for now in this format, and if they decided they do want to keep this sort of the structure moving forward, Notre Dame can't finish as higher than the 5 spot. And I was told that was kind of like a thing that they agreed to because everybody else plays a 13th game. Well, they don't play a 13th game. So their 13th game basically comes in the first round of the playoff every single time. But that fans of that team, which like most college football fan bases, Ohio State included, Notre Dame fans are a cult. And the first time that they are like undefeated, ranked 2nd or 3rd, and they're in the top 4 going into the conference championship weekend, and then they get jumped by some smaller conference champion for the 4 spot, and they end up as the 5th spot, that those fans are going to be absolutely just up in arms that it's going to be this year's version of FSU. It's going to be, how could you do this to us? How could you make us 5? We're undefeated, and we're one of the biggest brands in college football. Because either A, the people won't understand, they won't know that that's a rule. There's probably people who are college football fans, but they don't know all the ins and outs of everything, and so they'll be like, "Oh, I didn't realize that was a rule." Or they're just going to be mad because that's going to be the new thing to get mad at, which I think is also very fascinating in all this. I think too, like, there's an interesting conversation to be had here that I think that I want to get into with you, because as much as Notre Dame is a big brand, I'm kind of curious, like, what the incentive is for schools now in the Big Ten to schedule a team like Notre Dame who has no ties to your conference or anything like that. Because, and I guess the larger question here is, how much is out of conference schedule going to matter moving forward? You talked about it, like, how does this change the math on what matters that time of year, and when you set the playoff field and all these different things? I'm fascinated to see how much that specifically matters, that point, because we bring that up all the time, right? Well, who did Ohio State play? There's a reason Ohio State was number 1 for a period of time, and they jumped Georgia because they had the best out-of-conference schedule. They had played Notre Dame. They played some other teams. So that's where Notre Dame kind of comes in the equation here. But for Notre Dame, like, what is the incentive if the point for these teams is I want to have a good strength of schedule? Well, with conference realignment, conference expansion, the idea is that Ohio State, for example, is going to be playing USC more often. They're going to be playing Oregon more often. So their in-conference schedule is actually going to end up being tougher than their out-of-conference schedule, and they don't want to accumulate a whole or risk accumulating a bunch of losses and costing themselves a playoff spot or costing themselves the conference because they want that one seed. They want the first round bye in the playoff. So I'm curious, other than the blanket statement of, well, Notre Dame's a big brand, so it's always going to look good if you beat them on NBC. I get that. But other than that, what is the incentive for a team as we wonder about should Notre Dame join a conference, and is this going to be advantageous for them to stay independent now that they can't ever get a bye week going into the playoff? Like, is it an added incentive that maybe teams stop scheduling them as much if they're not really tied to a conference because they don't want to even risk the possibility that you lose to Notre Dame out of conference when you got a tough in-conference schedule?
I think it's always going to be a moving goalpost because you can't lock in. Unlike when you knew it was going to be 4 teams for a decade and you knew how it was set up, there's no, I mean, you're like your working theory or your game theory for the next 2 years is going to be different than what it is in 2026. And honestly, even in once they even lock in, let's say they do move to 16 teams, which apparently Big Ten commish Tony Petitti is really interested in pushing it in that direction. Which I think would negate the home field with the first round bye. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's just about getting teams in instead of giving your conference the best chance to win. I digress. But I think even once you get to 2026, you're not going to be able to breathe like, oh, well, now we know how this game's going to be played, because 4 years in, you could see with the way things are setting up. I mean, the 2026 and beyond is turning into a money grab by the Big Ten and the SEC. And all that is, it's colonialism. All that is a land grab, because they know if they can secure more money, and they, one of the things suggested that's going to be debated this week is tiered income based off, playoffs. So the SEC and the Big Ten would receive more than the ACC and the Big 12. Who would receive more than Mountain West and American, who would receive more than Conference USA, the MAC, and the Sun Belt. So you can't tell me that's not tied to the Big Ten and the SEC looking to snatch up teams, specifically in the ACC. So getting back to your Notre Dame point, I think that's part of this too. I think the point with them, I think all the other conferences are just trying to apply subtle pressure over time to get Notre Dame into a conference. At this point, I like if you went to the SEC and the Big Ten and said, Notre Dame's going to join one of your conferences, do you care who it is? I actually think they wouldn't care if they lost Notre Dame to the other conference, because it's just more important that they join a conference and join a conference other than the ACC.
I think Notre Dame cares, though, because
but
I don't think Notre Dame makes sense in the SEC. They'll get boat raced year after year. The Big Ten makes, I think, a lot more sense.
I would agree, but I think you're also not thinking like Notre Dame. Notre Dame still thinks it's 30 years ago. And listen, brand wise, they're correct.
They all have the same. They're all stuck in Lou Holtz's brain.
But Notre Dame is an elite brand. The problem is all the kind of things that hold them back from competing, all that kind of, we're smarter than you, we have a higher academic standard, we're a religious school, all that stuff in the end holds you back from recruiting against the Alabamas and the Georgias. And honestly, I think it's going to be the same thing against Oregon and Ohio State and USC and Michigan in the Big Ten. But I want to digress real quick, because I do think I think a big part of this is just we got to push them towards this and subtly nudge them towards joining conference. I also think at the end, I think it's going to be really fascinating the first time you have Notre Dame as the 1 seed, who's going to end up being the 5 seed in the playoffs. Meaning that, do you just go ahead and seed 1 through 4s as, all right, it's whatever the leaders in each one of those are, meaning regardless, who is the best of the SEC? That's the 1 seed. Best of the Big Ten is the 2 seed. Or do you just have them ranked within the top 15, top 20, understanding that when it all comes down, they're going to be the 1 through 4 seed? Because I think that's really interesting. Like, that's where you are going to get some contention. If Notre Dame's the true number 1 seed, but ends up having to be the number 5 seed, I think that's the kind of situation and scenario that could piss them off enough where they say, well, we got to play by these rules because we're being unfairly punished. The downside, because I want to give you a chance to get to that, the downside is I actually think Notre Dame hosting a playoff game might be exactly what they want. Like, that's the push and pull.
That's fair.
You could be the number 1 seed in the country. You're undefeated. They always have a tough schedule because they play everything's out of conference. You could be the rightful number 1 seed and have to go host a playoff game and play that extra playoff game as a 5 seed versus that 5 seed's at home, and you can't tell me that isn't going to add to some of that prestige of, well, you got to go through Notre Dame, you got to come through South Bend, whether it's the 5, 6, 7, 8 seed. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I thought about that too, just in regards to maybe they don't care about hosting an extra game in the playoff because they knew it was going to be a first round matchup that's at their place, and so there's some incentive to that. You get your crowd on your side. It's probably going to be like a lesser team coming in that you should be able to beat. But you also got to think like it's another game in the playoff on this sort of long journey to a championship that you got to play that maybe an Ohio State doesn't. And if you get a guy hurt, like that could derail your chances of beating a team like that. So there's some other factors there. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think you're right in that there's sort of some subtle urges to get Notre Dame into a conference. They're trying to sort of pull out all the stops, if you will, to get them there. And they're going to continue to be adamant that they don't want to, of course. But how and I do think, to your question, I think it'll ultimately end up being they'll move those teams up in the rankings to the top 4 spots. That's what I think it's going to end up being. I don't think it's just going to be like, well, Liberty was 13th, or it was 12th, so they're just going to stay 12 and get a bye. Like I don't think it'll work that way. But I do know like that would have been a factor this year because they mapped out like what the field would have looked like this year, and Liberty actually would have gotten in over. Oh God, I can't remember who it was. They were ranked like 14th or something like that, and they would have slipped down to that 12. Like they would have been in as the last highest ranked, the 5th highest ranked conference champion, and they would have jumped somebody, I think from the SEC, actually, ironically enough, to get in to the playoff this year if this format had existed this year. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that they'll end up reseeding them as like 1 through 4.
I do think, real quick on that, I do wonder if that ruins a little bit of the charm. Like maybe the charm in the playoff selection show, which there's great drama and theater to the 14 playoff selection show. Maybe the drama in the theater is, well, who's 1, who's 2, who's 3, who's 4. Maybe that's how they kind of see that.
Well, that would be the theater for the top 4.
Yeah.
I think though, you bring up theater, the theater of it. I think there's always going to be theater involved because you said it. Like we're just shifting the conversation from, well, how does FSU get screwed and miss the playoff as a top 4 team to, well, how does Ole Miss and Penn State get snubbed at 13? Like there's still going to be some very passionate fan bases around 13 and 12 where that conversation gets had. And we're going to have to sit there and sort of sort through those things and calm people down or whatever. I mean, hopefully Ohio State never has to worry about being that low in the rankings. But if it ever happened, like the same thing would be happening with the fan base here. So, yeah, I think to shift sort of towards the field expanding to 16, the way you put it earlier, I think is spot on. This feels to go from 4 and be so protective over, well, this protects the integrity of the game and making sure the regular season still means something. And 4 is good. And there's people who are still staunchly in the 4-team camp. And I always said from when they announced 4, I always said that it should be 8. I said 8 makes a lot of sense. You had 5 Power 5 conferences. All 5 of those teams get an auto bid when they win their conference. And then you give 3 at-large bids to, I don't know, maybe a smaller school or a smaller conference team that wins. Or a second SEC team that you think is really good, whatever, and you get an 8-team field. So they're jumping from 4 to 12, which I thought was I'm fine with 12, but I kind of feel I'm caught in the middle on this because I generally am team. I'm not going to complain about more football, and I'm not going to complain. I'm certainly not going to begrudge them from expanding the playoff field when we see playoff fields of that size or larger in all other sports. So I understand the concept there. But I do think on some level in college football, like there's a severe drop-off a lot of the time in the competitiveness. Now, maybe that continues to change with the NIL era. Maybe that continues to sort of add more parity or spread out the field a little bit where you do get some teams that are more competitive around the 14, 15, 16 mark. But I'm telling you right now, man, like here's a team that we've seen around those rankings in the last few years. Iowa, what is Iowa going to do? Like, what business does Iowa have with scoring 10 points a game? What business do they have being in the playoff in the first round against a number one seed Georgia that and this is where I sound like the old man yelling at cloud guy who's like, oh, this playoff expansion is bad for college football. I'm not trying to be that because I'm totally on board with it going to 12. I think it's a great thing for the sport, but I do think there's almost like a drop off or a breaking point, if you will, where it's more so just about, okay, we're just going to do more games because it's more money for us and less about like the competitiveness of the games. I think you can still get some decently competitive games, especially if you get two like SEC teams, like say it's Ole Miss and Georgia as a first round or as like a second round matchup or something like that. Like, yeah, I think that'd be great. But I don't know that still is the same when you spread it out even further and you're adding in some of these sort of mid teams that are going to be ranked around 15, 16, 17, because there's always like a 2-loss team around there that just has no business even sniffing the college football playoff.
Well, but isn't that the point of, and this is where I kind of do the flip side. The point of it is if you don't belong in the playoffs, you're going to get exposed real quick. So like on the years where Michigan State is a paper tiger and they get in on a technicality or they get on a whim of luck, well, yeah, they're going to have the natural advantage one way or another of winning their conference. But I mean, the beauty of it is if there's a better team out there, you're going to see it play out on the field. And so I think that's kind of the counter to that, even though I am a little bit, once you get, it's less about teams and it's more about the setups.
Once you like this format also makes sense right now as 12 teams when for the top seeds. Like if the goal is the top seeds should earn a little something like extra or more or whatever, because you're trying to give them somewhat an advantage, like isn't the 12-team format better? Because those teams then get that bye week. And I think that does matter in the context of this sort of road to the championship versus when you expand to 16, what is the actual incentive for a team like Ohio State to go all out and try to win their conference? They get to host a game. That's it. That's the only incentive.
So let's save that because I kind of want to wait for that just until we kind of see what comes out of this meeting in Dallas this week, because as of right now, Tony Petitti is the only commissioner that seems to be on board with moving to 16 teams. I think it is fait accompli at some point. It will. I just don't think it's fait accompli in 2026. But the other things we mentioned, tiered revenue distribution. The slate being wiped clean in 2026. So everything we've talked about for 24 and 25 probably won't matter at all for 2026. And the Big Ten and SEC could be fighting for multiple guaranteed bids, which is something to kind of pay attention to there. And this really could set up and trigger the financial dominoes that continue the consolidation of conference expansion and in some ways conference deletion going on in college football. So we'll have more on this, guys. Again, the second show this week, we're probably going to have more firm answers about what kind of went down in Dallas. But when we come back, I don't mind talking. And if you're a champion, you're allowed to talk. But let's be honest, Michigan, as they are now, are not the champions they were a month ago. We'll get into that here, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. Hey, guys, we are back. The show is back, and I got to be honest with you. We're not used to talking the rivalry here in February, on February 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 25th, whatever, because right now is the time where, but the rivalry's a little dormant this time of year. It kind of moves over to basketball. Don't pay attention to Michigan or Ohio State basketball this year. Nobody is, and least of all the actual programs themselves.
I thought it was don't sell the Buckeyes short. They did just get maybe the biggest upset win of the college basketball season and beating Purdue. Don't roll your eyes. They did. No, that was a huge win. I'm not saying it means anything.
Let me ask you.
I'm not saying it means they're going to make the tournament.
Did you care about Ohio State before Chris Holtmann ended up running this thing into the ground in the last year? Because I got to be honest with you, I didn't realize there were so many Ohio State basketball fans until these Ohio State fans who never talk about Ohio State men's basketball come out of the woodworks when the program goes in the dumper. Like when it's like the middle of the road, when they're like the 7th seed, that's cool for Ohio State fans. When they're bottom of the top, this is not the Ohio State basketball I grew up with. Like, well, I grew up with Randy Ayers, dog. All right, I grew up with Jim O'Brien. Like I grew up with like once every 5 years, you have a cold day in the sun, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's great to be a Buckeye fan." It's absolutely fraudulent. I'm not saying every person who claims to be an Ohio State men's basketball fan is fraudulent. I'm just saying there are a lot of bandwagon weirdos
Oh yeah, they
who
all
love
came
to
back.
hop on when they're at their absolute best, then don't pay attention to them when it's, the 7th seed, the 8th seed, the 9th seed in the Big Ten, only to come back ferociously when the program's one of the 4 worst in the Big Ten. I just think that's very funny, and I just want to be very honest about this. But we also have to talk about Sherrone Moore's comments here. And I'll be honest with you, if Jim Harbaugh made this same comment, I don't think I'd care as much. But Gus Johnson on Saturday night asked Sherrone Moore about Ohio State's recruiting prowess. And there's this narrative forming from Michiganders that, well, it doesn't matter what you do in recruiting if you can't prove it on the field. And I assure you that's not what they were saying when Ohio State was top 5 in every recruiting class and beating their ass for 20 years. Like Ohio State's recruiting prowess, and Jim Tressel, Urban Meyer, early Ryan Day got a lot of coaches fired, not just head coaches, but assistant coaches. But Sherrone Moore said in response, "We'll settle that in November." Spencer, your thoughts before I blow a gasket.
My initial thought when I saw this was to laugh. Not because like I'm laughing at like the state of the Michigan program. They're coming off a national championship. To your point, if they want to talk, they want to talk. But more so just the world the cycle that we're now living in, where it just feels like history is repeating itself, only with the roles being flipped here. This is so much like Ryan Day. I think it was in year 2 that he was at Ohio State when he took over for Urban Meyer, where he dropped the line. It was in the off season, and it wasn't even he didn't say it publicly either. That was the other thing. It kind of leaked out that he said this to his team in the locker room. So his was even a little bit different. So maybe it's not fully history repeating itself. This is just Sherrone Moore, I guess, straight up asking for it. He's like, I don't care. I'm going to drop nukes and see how that comes back to bite me or not come back to bite me come November, I guess. But the difference in that situation was it was a private thing that Ryan Day said that leaked out of the locker room, that he apparently told his guys, oh, well, because Jim Harbaugh had some things to say. And so his response was, well, we're going to drop 100 on them this year. We might drop 100 on them this year. And that became this big deal. And then Michigan fans used that against them when they finally beat them. They were like, oh, I guess you didn't drop 100 on us, blah, 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 blah. And it was this whole thing. And so they got the last laugh in that instance. And now I think I can't get over just the parallels between what's going on at Michigan right now, what's going on at Ohio State. The only difference is the year Urban Meyer left, Ohio State wasn't coming off a national championship. But other than that, the parallels are so similar. It's legendary coach who everybody knows with one of the biggest names in the sport. He leaves and departs for whatever reason. Urban left for different reasons, then went to the NFL later, and that was a colossal disaster. Jim Harbaugh is proven in the NFL. He goes to the NFL. He's gone. He's taken his whole staff with him, and Sherrone Moore is trying to build from the bottom up now with his staff and his team and all these different things. And it's just the same way. You got the coach sort of talking some shit to the other team, your biggest rival, which makes sense. That's going to happen, but you're doing it before you've really proven anything. And Sherrone Moore, just because he thinks, well, I beat Ryan Day head-to-head already. I won that game this past November, even though we know it was Jim Harbaugh's game plan, and you were just kind of doing what he was telling you to do. And now he thinks that he has the right, because they're national champions, to say some shit like this. And and what he said wasn't really that like harsh or severe. It wasn't even close to what Ryan Day said about hanging 100 on him. It's pretty mild as far as smack talk goes, like, oh, we'll settle in November. But it's just the idea that you think you have the room to talk right now because you're a national champion, all these things, and you think you've proven something because you filled in for Jim Harbaugh for a few games with a really, really loaded Michigan team. But really, what have you proven? people have plenty of questions about you as a coach, and we don't know what this thing's going to look like with your staff gutted and everything that's kind of coming your way, and JJ McCarthy and all these other guys from this great team you had going to the NFL. So in a situation like that, no matter what you say, I don't care if you just say, yeah, I don't. Ryan Day has a Scottish Terrier. I'm not really a Scottish Terrier guy. Like, I don't care if that was the smack talk. It's like, why say anything? Why give Ohio State any sort of bulletin board material in a year where they loaded up their team and their main goal, their number one goal, like a heat-seeking missile, is we're going to beat your ass next fall? I get it. It's kind of it makes the rivalry more fun. And Michigan's talking from a place where they kind of have the right to do so. But it doesn't make sense for me as a new, fresh coach who's taking over a program that now has some expectations to say anything of the sort. Just keep it very Kevin Stefanski-like.
So I will say, I think Sherrone Moore is going to be good for this rivalry because much like Jim Harbaugh,
is he going to cry if he loses?
He likes to talk. He does. He really loves to talk. He loves to chirp. And I think that's going to be a lot of fun. It's probably going to increase the hatred between Ohio State and Michigan, which I love. That being said, my issue is I don't think Sherrone Moore realizes the target on his back. Because Sherrone Moore's like, well, I've got it made. We're coming off an Natty title. I'm a Michigan man. All right. Like, I was the guy that won 4 of the 6 games Jim was suspended for. So yeah, sure. All these guys got fired. Or sorry, all these coaches went off to the NFL. Yeah, sure, I'm replacing most of this roster. But they're going to have patience with me. And that doesn't happen at Michigan. It doesn't happen at Ohio State. Like you mentioned how quickly things turn. It went from people, circling the wagons around Ryan Day, say, I'm going to hang 100 on them in a private conversation that was leaked to the media. It was that. It went from that to fire this clown after 2 losses. That's when the fire Ryan Day stuff started, right? And then obviously he went and damn near beat Georgia. But like, I think Sherrone Moore's in a much worse situation than Ryan because, yeah, there's a program built there, but like Ryan Day can have a bad recruiting cycle because of how they use the portal and because, well, as long as you hit on 2 of your other recruiting classes, it's fine. Michigan, it's a steady flow of talent that needs to be coming in those doors. You can't have it. And I think, like I said, I don't think Sherrone realizes the target that is on his back. And it's not from Ohio State. It's not from Oregon. It's not from Michigan State. No, it's from Michigan men. We've seen how they treat their own. We've seen how they treated Jim Harbaugh when 6 years in, Jim Harbaugh hadn't won a national title or hadn't beat Ohio State. Like, that's the kind of thing. Like, this is the kind of thing that very early on could get turned on Sherrone and weaponized to him. So, like, if Sherrone wins, it's not going to be an issue. But the second that you fall off that standard, Michigan fans are delusional right now because Michigan fans are saying, oh, we're totally cool. We know next year's going to be a rebuilding year. What about the year after that? What about the year after that? Because you don't get many gimmies in college football. And the second that Ohio State beats Sherrone Moore, because right now, that's what Michigan fans are hanging their hat on. Honestly, guys, that's why Sherrone Moore became the head coach of Michigan, because he beat Ohio State as the head coach, and that put them into the Big Ten title game, which that put them into the college football playoffs, which allowed them to win the national championship. So I'm just here to tell you, like, keep talking, Sherrone. Talk as much as you want, because in this whole rivalry, and I don't mean this disparagingly, I'm talking about from a resource perspective, Michigan is still David, and Ohio State is still Goliath. So you got the one time you threw the rock at the Giants' head and you landed it. Cool. Now the problem is you got to do it as the guy, and it is totally different when you're the guy. And I think that's very fascinating. I think there's a lot of mess being talked about Michigan. They've earned the right. Good for you, Booby. You won a national title. Let me pat you on the head. You got your first national title in damn near 30 years. It took you damn near 30 years to get it, but good for you. But man, I'm telling you, you talk this. It's different when a Michigan fan talks you and me smack than when a head coach goes on the record. And the funny thing is, we'll settle that in November. Okay, Yes, we will. Remember, that quote only goes on the back of t-shirts. That only goes on Nike slogans. It only becomes great and infamous if you actually settle it on the field, unless you get settled yourself.
It feels very much like the year where they had those unfinished business T-shirts that they printed, and then they lost like 3 or 4 games, and it was just like completely useless. Like, yeah, you're right. That only means something right now when you're sitting from a place where you're high and mighty on your pedestal. If you lose that game, what does that even mean? Like, what does that quote do for you down the line here? Once if you lose to Ohio State, and to your point too, I think Sherrone Moore has the same dilemma that Ryan Day has. He's not a Michigan guy. And what has Michigan done in most times where they had to hire a head coach? They've tapped the well of Michigan men that have gone through the program, and they've hired that guy. And for Ohio State, it was the same thing for a while until they finally realized, like, oh, we can find these other coaches that are going to be good for us, who aren't necessarily Ohio State guys. And Urban Meyer comes in, and he wasn't an Ohio State guy, and he leads the program to new heights. And that he's just one of several. But they kind of embraced that earlier on. And that is the reason, like, people use that against Ryan Day. They're like, well, he's not even an Ohio State guy. Why do we care about him? But the difference is, to your point, Ryan Day can tout these top recruiting classes every year. They're usually 1, 2, or 3 every single year with their recruiting classes. And as long as they can do that, they have that over Michigan. Michigan's usually has pretty good recruiting classes. They're usually maybe like top 15, top 10 in a good year, but they're not at the level that Ohio State is. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't shake things up and fire Ryan Day versus Sherrone Moore. Like, his bar is now set at, okay, we just won a national championship. He's right. He might get some leeway. He might get a little bit of a leash here, especially this next year, because you're coming off of that high, and they're not just going to fire you after a year after they brought you on. But you're right. Next year is the key. 2025 is the key. What does this look like when you're recruiting the kids? What does this look like after a potential loss to Ohio State? Are you going to lose 2 years in a row, or are you going to bounce back and get them that next year with your own recruits coming in? Because these things take time, and sometimes in a program like that, they don't give you the time that you think you're going to have to build it.
Well, and I just think, like, at Ohio State, the expectation is every single year you have to be in the playoffs, you have to beat Michigan. And I think Michigan's barometer for now is, well, you just got to beat Ohio State, and now it'll be like just be in the playoffs, right? Instead of being like a top 4 seed, just beat Ohio State and see if you can get in the playoffs. I think that changes. I think the farther you get away from a championship, I think the more ravenous your fans get to be, especially if Ohio State won next year. It puts the onus and the pressure right back on Michigan.
Yeah.
And so I'll be honest with you, I thought it was tough to win at Ohio State as a first-time head coach with Ryan Day. And we've seen some of that bear fruit with his relationship in the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry. I also think it's even harder to be a first-time head coach at Michigan. And it doesn't mean it won't work. I mean, Lloyd Carr did it, right? Like Schembechler did it. First-time head coaches at those spots. But here's the thing about that. This is a new era. And I think there's going to be a lot of buyer's remorse for Sherrone very early on. And I don't think they helped him by not running a legitimate search. Their search was, Jim, is he going to the NFL? Okay, cool. Sherrone, you're the head coach. And it doesn't mean he doesn't earn. It's not about deserving, because there's 10 guys that deserve any job on it. Luke Fickell's deserved the job 10 times over now, right? And he hasn't gotten it yet. So Mike Vrabel was a guy who had a realistic chance. Like, Mike Vrabel could have been one of those guys, that 2018, 2019 window, if he didn't get the Tennessee job, could have been the guy to replace Urban. So I just think you look at this, and I'm like, I think you're going to get to a point next year that if, let's say, you're a 8-win team and you lose to Ohio State and you're not in the playoffs, I think you're going to see the buyer's remorse right there. People saying, well, maybe we should have run a more robust search. Like, look at what Alabama did with Kalen DeBoer, a guy who had no ties to that school. Now, that doesn't mean that's the right way, but I'm just saying this is how we think as fans and media when all of a sudden you get that first taste of maybe not meeting the expectations.
Real quick here before we take a break, the only thing I'll say is that's the one thing I don't necessarily blame Michigan fully for, is not running a full search this time around. Because to your point, theoretically, you're Michigan. Like, you could go run a search and pluck any of these coaches from any of these schools, give them a job, And, it's that other school's problem that they have to figure out what they do. So I don't necessarily want to use the excuse of like, well, it was really late in the process, so you don't want to go take a coach and find someone. But I do think
an emotional decision. It was an
well,
emotional decision based in the afterglow. You don't listen. You don't make decisions in the post-nut clarity phase of life. You just don't do it.
Yeah. No,
all right. You have to give yourself time.
Yeah, I gotta recoup before round 2. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, but that might be what they're doing though. They're like, yeah, let's just sit for a beat and then we'll assess the situation next year before. So anyway,
let's have a cigarette and let's think about how great
the
that
cigarette
was.
is Sherrone Moore. No,
honestly, no. Think about it. You don't engage post-coital. You don't lay there both sweaty and all glistening and satisfied. Then go. We should get married. No, you let it breathe. All right. You wait till a couple days later, and if you still feel like you want to marry the other person, then you marry him.
I don't know if I have no response to this anymore. My take is now mute. It means nothing because there's literally no response to this analogy that you just brought to the table. So I'm just gonna sit on that one. I'm just gonna let it be.
It's probably fair. You never know if the wife is gonna be watching this.
No. I'm not even talking about anything inappropriate. I meant like my response to the Sherrone Moore thing. Like you just completely just bulldozed my entire case. Why I thought Michigan. Like, how am I supposed to respond to that? That is the greatest analogy that can ever be made. So I guess I lost this one. So listen,
make it a video.
You win some, you lose some. I lost this one, Nick. Congratulations. Nick Wilson 1, Spencer German 0 today.
I want this titled Sherrone Moore and Post-Nut Clarity. All right, guys. We got one more segment to go. And Sherrone Moore might have been too honest there. A legendary college football coach. Chose honesty and maybe a bit of a cop-out. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. Well, how the hell do we follow that up? By asking the very simple question, Sherrone Moore, we'll settle it on the field in November, or we'll settle it in November. Spencer, we come to the Michigan panic meter. Has that got you quaking in your boots about Michigan? Because tough talking Sherrone Moore wants you to know we're going to settle it on the field in November.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous now. I might end up in the sky. No, I'm kidding. I'm not moving. I'm in the dark gray. I'm assuming you're with me. If we're still in the hanging out in the dark gray. If anything, Sherrone Moore talking almost makes me feel better about beating the gray, because I think Ryan Day has learned at this point that he doesn't need to respond to any of that stuff. He just kind of keeps it okay, whatever. And I think this is just going to light the fire within the program even more to we just got to beat their ass next year. And if there's any other recruits that they can get in the transfer portal, or guys that maybe decide they're going to leave Michigan at some point in the next month or so, that maybe they'll steal and bring to Ohio State. I think they're just going to find more ways to sort of undermine that program and sort of rub it in their face when they meet in the field in November.
I just wish there was more gray we could go into. I wish it could be like.
Should we just make the meter an entire circle now? Life is a flat circle. The Michigan panic meter is a flat circle.
I just don't know how much more gray, stunningly gray. I'm trying to think of other shades of gray.
We need this to become a graphic now that moves on a video board, where the meter shakes and it goes the farther you get into the gray, it just shakes even harder, that you're you're that deep into the gray now. That would be the way to make it.
Is it the college football, the EA Sports game when they did the crowd impact? When you were playing,
the controller would shake.
Yeah. The controller would shake.
We haven't even talked about that, by the way. We got to talk about that Friday. We haven't talked about the game at all.
Let's just do it now. We'll save the Saban thing till later in this week, because now you make me want to talk about college football. So the trailer came out last week, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it. The trailer literally has nothing to do with the game itself.
It didn't matter, Nick. I was at full mast.
Everybody was just ready and raring to go, because it was like we're so ravenous for EA Sports College Football
I was in
2025.
pre-coital delusion at that point. That's what I was.
Yes, yes, yeah. It was pre-nut delusion, as it's called, and just ravenous. We need to get to post-nut clarity. That's where we are with college football 2025. But it's so funny, man. That the trailer was nothing but a dude talking, just in
It was
generalities,
well done. It was well done.
vagaries about college football. It could be, you could do that entire speech, you could put to almost anything in life because it's so generic, but it's set to the backdrop of, college football jerseys being made. And it just made me want it that much more.
In
Spencer.
the Rose Bowl, nonetheless. It was in the Rose Bowl was the backdrop. That was awesome.
Yep.
So I'm going to tell you, first of all, I talked about this at 92.3 as well on the air the other day, but this game is going to be like I've been putting off investing in a PS5. So normally my strategy is the first year or two when the game systems come out, they're fully priced, and then the second year, like around Christmas time, they do like this, $100 off thing for Black Friday or whatever, and that's usually when I go buy it. It's like, okay, I'm 2 years into it. There's still a longer life for this thing, and so I kind of waited. But the problem is this time around, because of COVID and the chip shortage and all that stuff, that never happened where they did like that rollback of the price and you got like a better deal on it. So I didn't get it. I haven't bought one yet. And so I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. And I was like, there's going to be a cutoff where I have to just buy one because I'm not going to get NCAA football 2025, or I guess they're not calling it that anymore. It's college football 2025. I'm not going to get that for a PS4. I have to get it for the new system.
Yep.
And so that time is coming. I'm going to have to like the Pied Piper, or not the Pied Piper, but the taxes are going to come due, if you will. I'm going to have to pay for it at some point and just bite the bullet because I got to play this game on the new system. So that's the one thing I'm kind of waiting for is, can I hit on a bet that'll give me the money I need to buy this thing, or am I just going to just bite the bullet and pay for it myself? And the other thing is my biggest concern for the game, which I don't know how you feel about this, but my biggest concern for the game is that they're going to do it. I think it was 2018 NBA 2K that they just went way too deep on the microtransactions, and that game was fucking awful because of it. So I'm deathly afraid.
Talking about NIL and transfer portal.
Well, yeah, like because of the NIL stuff and they're paying the players. Like I just wonder if it's going to be for your team to really have a chance to like land, like whatever team you start dynasty mode with. If you're for your team to really have a chance, you're going to have to spend all this extra money on, well, hey, I'm going to go to this kid's living room and pay him this much money. And it actually comes out of your, like, it's basically like you're contributing to a collective in a video game, which is even stupider than it sounds. So that's my biggest fear, is that they're going to overdo with the microtransaction stuff, because I think that'll ruin things for a lot of people.
So I think that's a fair concern. I honestly, there were some years where recruiting, like the in-between years, like towards the end, recruiting was so intuitive. Or not intuitive, sorry. It was so deep in how much time you had to spend on it.
It was awesome.
I really think they need to take a page from the text-based sim game where you can assign tasks. Basically, it's like a way to sim it, but you can assign tasks at like a daily, a weekly, a monthly level on like a game like Out of the Park, which is a baseball game. And what that allows you to do is it basically increases the importance of spending on assistants. So I think the simpler thing would be to allow yourself to, have the GM model, have the head coach model, have the assistant model, and then be able to assign tasks to individual. You can't do it all. Like, it wouldn't make sense if you could just sim literally everything. But it'd be cool to be able to say, all right, each assistant has 3 tasks this week, or each assistant has 3 things they're in control of when we sim. Like, I think that's the kind of thing that makes an incredible amount of sense, because if it's all about, well, the head coach has to do it, that might be as authentic as hell. But I do think you can lose people in the weeds. So that is my hope. I hope they get really creative. One of my favorite things that Madden used to do was when you had owner mode, you had GM mode, you had head coach mode.
Yeah, you could set the price for the hot dogs in the stadium. You remember that?
Yes. And I always would relocate a team. Like, I'd relocate Pittsburgh to St. Louis just to be a D. And then
you would literally sign up to be the GM of the
I'd tank
Steelers
him into
just
the
to
ground.
move them.
I'd tank him into the ground, and then I'd move him to like
Wow. What
LA
a
or whatever.
vindictive motherfucker to do
Yeah.
some shit like that.
I don't think you've understood. I'm that guy. Okay. When I sports hate, I don't sports hate often because I want to be as much of a sports fan of people as I can be. But if you land on the wrong side of me, I'm Hungarian. There's no going back. And honestly, I used to do it. I wouldn't do this to Michigan, but like when I would realign conferences, when they allowed conference realignment, I'd move Michigan to like the MAC, and then I'd move like Bowling Green up. Like I'd do stuff like that.
God.
And so like my friends would log on and play with me, like, "What the hell are you doing?" And I'm like, "Vengeance. Don't worry about it." But no, I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned the thing about now I actually got to get a PS5 because I'm right there with you. Like, this is the game. Like it's this, or if they actually did a Call of Duty that was about like like World War II, which I thought was my favorite one. World at War. I think
your favorite war? Yeah.
Like
I'm a big World War II guy.
Give me Civil War, although that'd be a little messed up. But the point is, now
we might be headed for another one of those.
We're going in the wrong direction. So all right. Think post-nut clarity. We got to get to it. But no, I do think I think this game or like a really great Call of Duty game that wasn't just whatever the crap they're doing now are the two games that could really, or like honestly a Major League Baseball game that was more fun.
MLB The Show is good though. I love MLB The Show.
But to me, it's like Madden. It's like okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's similar year to year. Yeah. The only thing I'll say, since we're naming games now, it's college football 2025, and for me, it's probably a Red Dead Redemption 3. That game is probably we've gone off like this has nothing to do with Ohio State football whatsoever. This episode of Sons of the Shoe here as we close it out.
I think they pick it up.
I think that Red Dead Redemption 3 or Red Dead Redemption 2 is like the best open world game ever created. That game is freaking fantastic.
So can I submit something?
Sure.
The the GTA series, if they ever bring back Turf Wars, San Andreas, and I've
said this, 6 is coming soon.
Yeah, but they're not going to do Turf Wars because it's insensitive, and I understand that. But Turf Wars to me, I used to spend, hours on end just snatching up turf and finding I'll be honest with you, I never made it to the end of the game because I didn't care. I only wanted everybody's turf, and I turned everybody's turf from purple and yellow into green like you would not believe. Now, I'm glad you mentioned other kind of franchises.
I played Red Dead Redemption 2 so much, especially during COVID, that I think I by the end of it, I was probably sitting there playing the game in a cowboy hat with boots on and a piece of straw coming out of my mouth, and was talking to my wife like this: "Hey, honey, what's for dinner tonight?" That's how much I played that game.
And was she like, I should have chosen better? Like this is so real quick. How do you NCAA football? Do you go mid-major? Do you go small school and then build yourself up and then go? Or do you try and go Ohio State? Do you try and go blue blood job right out of the gate?
So I usually start with like doing the blue blood thing of which is like my favorite team, which would obviously be Ohio State. So I'll probably start one that's with Ohio State, and because I think like you have the ties to your own team. But then I think once you play at least like 1 year of that season and you get like your championship and all this different stuff, then I think I revert to like, okay, now I'm going to start at like a small school and see if I can work my way maybe back to Ohio State, but like work my way up in the way that like, other people have like done. And that is a fun way to do it. I think I usually start with just choosing my favorite team and do it. And then I kind of go from there. But I kind of like the idea of, especially now we haven't had this game since 14. And the idea, or I guess that would have been 13 going into 14. The idea that since I worked at Akron, like the idea of starting at one point in time, the idea of like starting with a program like Akron and the MAC and like building my way to something else, I think sounds like a lot of fun. So I'll probably will do that at some point.
I always, out of loyalty to my alma mater, I always start BG.
That's fair.
But there are so many programs that I have some sort of love with that were either not in the game because
I can't start with my alma mater, nor do I want to, because frankly, I don't want to give that that place a championship.
I think you got to bring them from the Division III circuit. I think you got to bring them all the way up, like Delaware from Division II to Division I
Well,
AA.
I
Now,
thought that because there was some talk that Notre Dame maybe wasn't going to be in the game. They just announced this week that they will be. Like they were working at the NIL stuff with their players, and I
be the
thought
most
that
Notre Dame thing ever.
they could just make my alma mater the Notre Dame wannabes in the game, and they could just replace them for a period of time.
So
Because that's basically what they are. They think they're Notre Dame, but they're not.
The team I'm most excited for is probably App State and the Charlotte 49ers. And I really fell in love with the Sun Belt when I lived in Charlotte.
App State looks awesome.
But like App State's unis are just badassery.
Yeah.
And so are the 49ers,
that campus
by the way.
is sweet too.
Like Boone is so, I mean, dude, I gotta be honest with you. It's cold in Boone, and they have a lot of snow, and they have a lot of BS that I wouldn't want to put up with. But I'd love to have a cabin in Boone one time, nice. I'll be. I don't know. I'd ever come down. I'd look like Daniel Boone. I'd look like Paul Bunyan. But getting back to it, there's probably 10 to 15 teams that would actually more than that. But there are of the teams that weren't in the last version. There are 10 to 15 teams I can't wait to play as or play against. And I'm thinking about, I hope they give you a lot of control in the back end because I want to set up a group of 5 playoff, but that's neither here nor there.
I also one thing I always used to do real quick, because I loved Boise State's turf at the time. Like it was still like a fresh thing at the time. So I would always, when you could do like the create your schedule, I wouldn't even do like a home and home. Like, you know how these schools schedule like a home and home? I would just every year I put Boise State on the road like week 2 of the season. It was always a thing that I would do. I love that.
All right, guys, we got to bounce. Leave your comments in the section. Outside of Ohio State, who are you most excited to play in the NCAA football game? Leave the comments there. Do you take any umbrage with what Sherrone Moore said? Leave the comments in the 92.3 The Fans YouTube channel or hit us up on social media at Nick Wilson Says, at Spencito _. And please make sure to follow the show. Apple, Spotify, 92.3thefan.com, the free Odyssey app. We exist because you guys allow us to exist with your interest. We got to duck, guys, but thank you so much for hanging out with us today, and go Bucks.